just a forewarning. This chapter, this is the second lecture on the chapter on the new power balance. Last time I talked about technological side of things. This time I'm going to talk about other things. But I'm not quite sure what they will be yet because I haven't talked about them yet. One of the concerns that I have, perhaps an overriding concern, is this question of whether the 19th century is different. Is it a singular century, or have things occurred before within parallel time frames with similar degrees of change taking place, with the change exhibiting somewhat parallel degrees of complexity. The comparison I want to suggest would be between the period 1700 and 1900 in Europe and European colonialized or influenced areas, and the period 100 to 300 in the Roman Empire. These are periods, and I would say, of comparable degrees of change. In other words, you go from having a unified empire under the family of Augustus to having a Christian empire under Constantine that has now been, has by the year 300 been divided into an Eastern and a Western empire, and is now heavily populated, particularly in its frontier areas, by a new ethnic group, or new ethnic groups, I should say, whether they are Berbers in North Africa or Germans along the Rhine and along the Danube. It's a huge political change. All right, accompanying that, you have an extraordinary period of syncretism and of the spread of new ideas, often very dramatically competing ideas. So that when you look at the early history of Christianity, you do not see a single unidirectional process, but rather you see a series of strongly competing views that spread among different people and ultimately are incompatible. Some of those views get categorized as heresies. For example, most of the Germans in Europe followed the views of a bishop named Arius, and therefore were called the Arians. This has nothing to do with the word Aryan used by the Nazis or to talk about the early Indo-Europeans. These are simply followers of a bishop named Arius. His view of Christianity was that Jesus Christ was not God. He was not part of a Trinity. There were various versions of this. Some of them were adoptionism, whereby Jesus was adopted by God, or other things in which Jesus takes on a certain divine quality, but is certainly not a counterpart to the Creator God who created the universe. This became the standard view for many German peoples for several centuries, even after it was declared an abominable heresy in the Council of Nicaea in 325 in Nicaea, outside of Constantinople. So there were views like this that were classified as heresies, but there are many other views that were outside the Christian purview. Isis worship, or Osiris worship, or Manichaeism. These were all competing views. Now, most of them fall into the area of religion, but not entirely. Neoplatonism which was extremely popular in this period, had to do with a kind of elevation of Plato's ideas of absolutes to a level that was compatible to some degree with the notion of divinity, so that you had the idea of a creation of the universe or a structure of the universe implying a creative intelligence, where you went from a prime mover, a first principle, down through the several levels of spheres for the planets and for the moon and the sun, finally down to the earthly sphere, also known as a sublunar sphere, which is the sphere that we inhabit. Then within that sphere you had the four elements of earth, air, fire, and water, whereas the celestial spheres were usually thought of as being pure fire. These were views you could get to without any divine revelation. They can come straight out of contemplation of the completely, let us say, human writings of Plato and his followers, like Plotinus and Porphyry and so forth. So it isn't strictly a matter of of religions. And I stress that because the comparable phenomenon you have in the 19th century consists of a whole series of isms. Marxism, socialism, utopianism, and a wide variety of nationalisms. And they compete, and some of them are profoundly antithetical to others. In other words, for much of the history of Marxism, devoted as it was to the idea that there should be international solidarity among the working class, among the proletariat, the idea that you would have nationalism that would stress primary affection for the state within the boundaries of that state, or also encompassing the imperialist ambitions of that state. These are incompatible. You couldn't be a Marxist and a nationalist, at least of certain kinds, because one was international and the other was national. Or by the end of the century, the contradiction between Marxist inspired socialism and Zionism. Zionism said that there is something here that is specific to a people defined as being Jews, whether one is defining that as a religious group or as an ethnic group, whether it's a nationalism or whether it is a religious movement. Different brands of Zionism will see it in different ways, but it would be seen as incompatible with Marxism in its international form, which was not compatible with the idea that you'd have one group singled out. And yet you had many, many Zionists who were socialists, who said, I can be a socialist, but a communist, a Marxist-Leninist, believing in a world revolution, that's incompatible with my Zionism. So, as in those formative years of the Roman Empire, or the Roman Empire beginning its decline, you have an enormous competition in ideas, and the competition is taking place within a similar time frame. Now, it's true that you have print media and higher, fast transportation and so forth in the modern period, but the rate at which people were able to communicate these new ideas around the Mediterranean in the Roman Empire is really quite surprising. How much people knew from one part of the Mediterranean or the Roman world to another. Now, the reason, I think, that this parallel is never drawn. I've never read anything that drew this particular parallel. Is that we are encouraged to look at political philosophies differently from religions. And we're encouraged to think that that there is no basis for comparison of a political philosophy or a social or an economic philosophy with a religion. And I think that's wrong. The reason I think it's wrong is one that I've talked about before in this class, and that is that the crucial element in any spread of something new is the dynamic of the spread rather than in the substance of what it is that is new. And you've seen me before draw a graph on a board that looks like this, where you have a logistic curve in which the process of adoption of something follows this standard curve. This curve that's been replicated hundreds and thousands of times in various areas, where you start with a very small number of adopters. They influence, each of them, a certain number of potential adopters, some fraction of whom adopt the new thing, and then each of those new adopters contacts another group of potential adopters, so that you have a chain reaction in which the curve is irrelevant with respect to the content of the adoption. It is a curve that shows the spread of information. The rate at which the information spreads will determine the slope of the curve. In other words, it can look like this, using this as a time scale, or it can look like this, or it can look like that. That has to do with the particular phenomenon that you're looking at. But basically, what you're looking at is a exponential growth of expansion of information that has an inflection point that then reverses it, so that it slows at the same rate that it sped up to begin with, because the number of potential adopters that each individual encounters becomes smaller, simply because so many people have already adopted the thing. Now, this curve has been used, as I said, hundreds and thousands of times for describing certain things, particularly epidemic diseases and adoption of institutional or technological innovations. It's been used to not only to describe the rate of and pattern of adoption, but it has been used also to predict an adoption curve, so that it also is used very much in advertising to model the adoption curve that you hope to have. And when you look at it from that point of view, or from any point of view actually, you can divide the curve into certain categories that are symmetrical categories. Let's say this curve is the integral, the bell-shaped standard distribution curve. So here is your average. Here you have one standard deviation from the mean. Here you have 2 standard deviations from the mean. Here you have 3, and so forth and so on. In other words, the categories of people who are transmitting information can be defined in statistical terms. And then for people who study this carefully, they will proceed to ascribe social qualities to the people who are in each category. So they'll say, okay, let's assume that, that's your Model T Ford, your mean adopter. When everybody is in this time period from 1 standard deviation above and 1 standard deviation below the mean, this is where you're getting your mass adoption of automobiles. But who is adopting automobiles here? Who is the first person to adopt it? And then the people who study this will say, well, this is a different personality type, or it's a different social category. Maybe it's a difference in wealth. Maybe it's a difference in education. But certainly, the people who are adopting here are not the same people who are adopting here, nor the same people who are the last ever to buy a car who are adopting here. So the people who study innovation diffusion using this sort of model break it down into social categories. But the constant in these studies is that the thing is the thing. If it is a type of hybrid corn, it's a type of hybrid corn. If it's an automobile, it's an automobile. If it is an iPod, it's an iPod. When you try to apply this kind of thinking to intellectual diffusion or intellectual innovation instead of material innovation, that is to say, when you try to apply it to a religion or a political philosophy or a social outlook or to institutions that are inspired by those things, then you get a new complication that you don't have when you apply it rather simply to an area of technological diffusion. And that is that the way the thing is understood may change. In other words, let's say, those people who became Christians between 1 and 200 AD did not have the same view of Christianity as those people who became Christians 2 standard deviations from the mean later. So that if you compare the Christianity described by St. Paul in the epistles of the New Testament, and you see him assuming that the Christians belong to very small groups of people who meet in private homes. Many of the leaders are women, and a characteristic of the meeting is that people will witness miracles, and that they will sense the receipt of gifts of the Holy Spirit. That is to say, they will feel the Holy Spirit enter into them, enabling them to do things that they could not otherwise do, such as heal the sick, or handle serpents without being bitten, or speak in tongues, or understand other people when they speak in tongues. Tongues meaning speech that is otherwise unintelligible, not in any known language. This is what we would now call Pentecostalism, and that is how Christianity is described at that time. But you go 200 years later, or even 100 years later, and the Christianity is very different. So that by the time of by the time you get around to 300, the end point that I'm talking about for this comparison, you're at a stage where you have the possibility that an emperor will sponsor a religion, will declare it to be the religion of the entire empire. You have an establishment of bishops and patriarchs who have spatial responsibility for the appointment of priests. You have mechanisms that have begun to show up for distinguishing true faith from false faith. And it's very possible that most of those people who became Christians here would not still have been Christians if you'd gone up to here, because Christianity had changed. This, of course, is a zero-sum situation in which, as people become Christians, it means that they're stopping becoming something else. So what you have here is a change in which both parts of a zero-sum division are undergoing change according to the rate and perception of change that's taking place. So that those people who let's say, who are excited by being the very first to adopt something, they're not going to be excited once it changes. But other people who would be horrified by the idea of being the first to adopt something, they may be attracted by these changes. Similarly, as communities lose believers, they begin to change their attitude and to become, let us say, more guarded and protective, and ultimately to become rigidly endogamous, and to preserve their being, say that we'll not allow anyone to join our group, which is sort of a flip side of saying we won't let anyone leave our group. And you get sort of frozen remnant religions like the Zoroastrians of today. All right. I've talked about this in other lectures, so there's nothing new about this particular approach to things. But if you apply it to the 19th century, it has certain implications. In other words, take Marxism. Here you have a doctrine that begins in the middle of the 19th century, leads to the Russian Revolution, the establishment of the USSR, and the creation of Marxist communist parties, not just throughout Europe, but throughout the world. If we had the numerical data, we could probably draw, I'm sure, in fact, we could draw a graph that would show the number of adherents to Marxist thought distributed over a time scale. I am persuaded, largely by myself, that if you actually collected all that data relating to who is a card-carrying communist, as the term eventually becomes, but of course initially you didn't have parties and cards and things like that. But my guess is that committed Marxists, if you aggregated them over time, you would have a curve that would look like that. That initially you had a few people who became Marxists. And then they talked about this doctrine to other people, and you had more people. And they talked about it, and you had this logarithmic expansion of information. Now, maybe no surprise in that. Maybe it wouldn't be quite that curve. But my guess is that that would be the likely curve that you would get. But the implication that you have carrying over from the example I gave with Christianity is that Marxism changes. And that what Marxism is changes over time according to the nature of the adopting population and what their expectations are. When I have worked on religious conversion from this point of view, I've used two axioms. One of them is that people do not voluntarily adopt a new ideology or a new religion if by doing so they think they are going to clearly damage their economic or social position. Secondly, people do not voluntarily adopt a new ideology, or rather, when people adopt a new ideology, part of their expectation is that it will satisfy needs or desires that could not be satisfied by the old ideology. Okay, so when, let us say, workers adopted Marxism and formed radical or revolutionary labor unions or revolutionary cells hoping to bring about a communist revolution in this country or that country, were they, what was that doing to their status? If they were an intellectual, and this is of course one of the most difficult categories to deal with when you come to Marxism, is that it's a strongly intellectual, highly literate ism, so that many of the people who are adopting are intellectuals. Do they reduce their economic or social status by becoming Marxists? It is hard to know, and it's been debated within intellectual history as to what is the position of someone who chooses to become a revolutionary Marxist, whereas in fact they are the inheritor or set to be the inheritor of a landed estate or something like that. And usually one turns to the idea that the appeal is not to the social or the economic status, but rather to the intellectual concept of solidarity with the proletariat. As far as the proletariat goes, the idea is that by joining together in a radical labor organization, whether it's a revolutionary cabal or whether it is a militant labor union, you are likely to improve your status. For both groups, looking at it from a slightly different angle, the idea that you are, through Marxist ideology, going to acquire some good that you did not previously have, I think that's probably pretty valid. I think that the intellectuals or the elites who became Marxists felt that they were gaining in their intellectual or philosophical or moral lives, that they were gaining something that was missing in their life before. If you want to look at this sort of conundrum, I recommend reading the play Dirty Hands by Jean-Paul Sartre. In it, you have it's set in Eastern Europe, where after World War II, there's been a takeover by a communist party. The party wants to assassinate a certain nationalist leader because he's standing in the way of the party, but they don't know how to do it because he is well guarded. And the intellectual, who's a member of the Communist Party, volunteers and says, I will be the assassin. And they say, well, how will you do it? He say, well, I will become his secretary, and I will be able to gain close contact with him because, unlike you, I'm an intellectual and I have the qualifications to be his secretary. And they say, well, how will you, when you carry out the assassination, are you willing to forfeit your life? He said, well, my scheme is that I will be his secretary. I may be butchering the plot a little bit, but not much. I'll be his secretary, and I will be living in his house with my wife, and I will claim that the assassination is a crime of passion because he has gone all Herman Cain on my wife, and therefore is deserving. We'll just cut this out of the YouTube part of this. Anyway, I'll claim it as a crime of passion. So anyway, this happens, and he assassinates the leader, and he is tried, and he is not executed because the court is willing to believe that he was motivated by a crime of passion because of this man's advances on his wife. So he serves his term in prison, comes out, and goes back to the party and says, I did it. The whole plan was done. I did the assassination, I did my time, and now I'm back. And the party says, yeah, you're an intellectual and not a worker, and we think it was a crime of passion. So we're not going to honor you just because you carried out this assassination, because as an intellectual, you couldn't really be part of this. Well, now, that's not an unusual situation when you have ideological movements. The notion that people come from different strata and are drawn to a movement because they see it changing them or offering an opportunity to change, their material motives may be dramatically different. When I studied this for the rise of Islam, I argued that the earliest converts to Islam after the Arabs had moved into Iraq in particular, that the earliest converts to Iran came from the ends of the social spectrum. They were the poorest and the richest. They were the poorest because to be a landless peasant and to be down and out was a worse position than to be a flunky of the Arabs, shining their sandals or, whatever the flunkies did. But in order to be a flunky of the Arabs, you had to convert to their religion. So for landless peasants, we know landless peasants, to some degree, flocked to Islam in Iraq. And we know this because the governor of Iraq tattooed the name of their village on their hands and sent them back to the village and said, you're just trying to evade labor and taxation. We won't accept your conversion at face value. Then at the other end of the social scale, you had Persian landowners of great estate who had fought against the Arabs, been captured in battle, and in order to escape the slavery that would be the normal status for a prisoner of war, they converted to Islam. So the non-Arab converts, you now find having a sort of bimodal distribution in this earliest phase. You have some of them who are from the top of the social scale. This is like, Tolstoy becoming a socialist. I mean, some of the richest people in Europe with strong social positions endorsed these new ideologies. And then you had another group who are at the bottom of the social scale, who are joining the same movement. You find the same thing in Christianity. Frequently, people will say, well, Christianity appealed to the slaves in the Roman Empire. Well, yeah, it probably did. On the other hand, when you read the epistles of Paul, he's not writing to slaves. He's not writing about slaves. The people he's writing to clearly are people of substantial position in society, rather than people who are toiling under the yoke of Roman slavery. So I think my guess is that when you have movements of ideological change, that when they start out, you have a certain incoherence, not necessarily to the doctrine itself, but incoherence that came from different expectations of different groups who are joining the movement. And that changes in the ideology have to do in part with rationalizing these differences, with trying to get everybody on the same page, trying to make the ideology or the religion acceptable to people who've come into it from different starting points. In that process, it's important that some people be thrown out because they're not, they're not clubbable. They're not ready to move toward the center. And one of the things that you have with new religions, as you have with new 19th century ideologies, is that they frequently split. They have reciprocal moments of anathema where they condemn one another, like the Marxists throwing out the anarchists, for example, or later on the Stalinists throwing out the Trotskyites. Or more broadly, the whole question of whether one is a Marxist communist or a socialist. Because this is another problem that you have, is that when you have multiple adoption processes underway at the same time, they frequently conflict and they aim at the same audiences. So socialism in various forms comes into being in the 19th century, and it is not necessarily compatible with Marxism, although it may adopt some of the views of Marxism. And ultimately, you may get to a point, or you did get to a point, where Marxist communists felt that their greatest enemy was the socialists, and vice versa, because they were essentially competing for the same adopter population, in the same way that the Christians would find the Manichaeans to be a unacceptable religion, because really they're competing for the same adopter population. So in the life of St. Augustine, he starts out, his first enthusiasm is as a Neoplatonist, and he follows philosophy. Then he shifts and becomes a Manichaean, and is an ardent Manichaean. He really thinks that Manichaeism is the truth. Then he becomes a Christian. And at that point, the Manichees are the worst people in the world. They are magicians and charlatans and frauds, and he now condemns the Manichees. Then he goes on to discover that within Christianity, there are a bunch of heresies that are really awful, and that he should now spend the rest of his life as the Bishop of Hippo in trying to destroy the heretical Christians that were in Tunisia at that time. So you look at this in the history of sectarianism, and you say, okay, you have this sect and that sect, and they disagree on this, and here is their position on that. You look at them in terms of intellectual history, and you see conflicts and overlaps. But if you look at it in terms of adopter history, you see competition for souls, where you might have two doctrines that are extraordinarily similar, but will become hostile to one another because they are competing for the same adopter population. In other words, you're having a whole bunch of these curves occurring at the same time. Okay, so you have socialism, Marxism, utopianism, anarchism, but then you have nationalisms. Nationalisms, I say in the plural because you have many different national movements. They're competing as well. Some of the nationalisms are socialist, some of them are not. Some of them may be anarchistic in some respects, and others not. But the defining characteristic of the nationalisms is that they see themselves as having a restricted adopter pool. Now, that adopter pool may consist of all of the people who have a certain quality, whether they realize it or not. Like you can say, all those people who speak German should be part of German nationalism, even though they are spread across 10 or so countries. So you have German speakers in Poland, German speakers in Russia, German speakers in Hungary, German speakers in Slovakia or Bohemia, German speakers in Germany, and so forth. You can have a German nationalism that is far broader than any nation, and then you can try and operationalize it. Or you can have a nationalism that is smaller than an existing political entity. Take Basque nationalism or Catalonian nationalism in Spain, where you have a Spanish kingdom with a long history, and that long history has included a number of different regions that have linguistic differences. In the case of Catalan, not that different from Castilian Spanish. In the case of Basque, an entirely different language. And so you can have a nationalism that develops defining the nation according to something that is not parallel to the polity. The adopter pool then is kind of a notional thing. I know that Benedict Anderson's work on imagined communities sort of presumes that a community comes together and imagines itself in terms of everyone being a part of it, and that becomes an operational reality through the operations of the press and the adoption of national language and so forth. But it doesn't always work that way. In other words, if you look at the history of Arab nationalism, it'd be very difficult to apply this notion of an imagined community. In other words, you could say everyone whose mother tongue is Arabic is an Arab and therefore part of the great Arab nation. And this is what an early Arab nationalist, or even Arab nationalists down to the 1950s, would say. But then if you looked at it from, say, Benedict Anderson's notion that the underlying factor should be a shared language, you'd say, yeah, but Arabs in Morocco can't understand Arabs in Yemen, and Arabs in Yemen can't understand, Arabs in some other area. Or you have people who are classified as Arabs who don't speak Arabic, like the Somalis, who are sort of Djibouti ends up in the Arab League for reasons totally unknown. Plus you had the fact that the word Arab was considered really up even into the early 19th century as applying only to people who spoke Arabic who lived east of Egypt. Egypt had Egyptians. Arab in Egyptian colloquial dialect referred to nomads, referred to Bedouin. It didn't refer to, and a Misri. I'm an Egyptian. And an Arab. Who's going to say that? Arabs are, dirty Bedouins. The same thing the Turks thought. We talk about Turkish nationalism, but in the 19th century, the word Turk was a pejorative term for a nomad. If you were a citizen, a subject of the Ottoman Sultan, you were not Turk, you were Osmanlı, you were an Ottoman. And so we have this anomalous time when we have something called Ottomanism. The late 19th century, people say, well, can we have a nationalism that is not predicated upon a language or an ethnicity, but rather upon a constructed state-defined identity, which we can call Ottoman. You had people who were devoted to Ottomanism, and others who became devoted to Arab nationalism or to Turkish nationalism, and their conceptual adopter pools are all overlapping. So some Turkish nationalists will say, well, Turkish nationalism should include all of the people who speak related Turkish languages in Central Asia. So Turkic nationalism of this sort would include all the people the Turkish speakers of the Ottoman Empire, plus those people who lived in the Central Asian possessions of the Tsar, or later the USSR, going all the way across to Kazakhstan, which borders on China. And now we would say, well, those are different languages. Istanbuli Turkish, Azeri Turkish, Turkmen Turkish, Uzbek Turkish, Kyrgyz Turkish, Kazakh Turkish. These are all different languages. They are, but they are actually closer to each other than Moroccan Arabic is to Iraqi Arabic. Moroccan Arabic, to me, just sounds like a jumble of consonants. I have no idea what they say, but it's a difficult dialect of Arabic. And it's very different from, say, the dialect of Tunisia or the dialect of Egypt. So even the definition of what constitutes a language becomes a complicating factor. And you have other places where you have a language that everyone agrees upon, that it's one language, and yet you have no nationalism developing because you have other divisions. And here, in particular, in India, in the 19th century, you have the language known as Punjabi. There is a province of Punjab in Pakistan and a province of Punjab in India. They speak exactly the same language. They are divided by religion. And there are three religions. You have Hinduism, predominantly among the Punjabis of India, Islam, predominantly among the Punjabis of Pakistan. Then you have the Sikhs, who show up in both India and Pakistan, and who have no state of their own defined by their religion. Is there a national literature that could have been used to generate a state ideology? Yeah, the same romances, the same poems, the same literary figures are esteemed on both the Pakistan and the Indian side of the border, but you don't get any movement of Punjabi nationalism that sweeps across the entire Punjabi-speaking population. So simply having let's say, a proto-national language, let's say a language that is sufficiently unified and mutually understandable that it could develop into a national language and the basis for nationalism, does not mean that you're actually going to have it. The nationalism is not a necessary development. It is a contingent development. It depends upon other circumstances. Now, what those circumstances were in the 19th century, or even in the 20th century, are very obscure. Why do you have a Catalan nationalism in Spain, but you don't have a Venetian nationalism in Italy, when the dialect of Venice would be dramatically different from the dialect of, say, Florence, where you have kind of the Urheimat, the homeland of the unified Italian language. What are the things that determine where you have a nationalism and where you don't? And I would say that part of it has to do with this question of overlapping adopter pools. That a larger nationalism is going to conceptually have a larger adopter pool than a smaller nationalism. On the other hand, with Arabic, it turned out the adoption pool was too large. And you get Arab nationalism developing in this comprehensive fashion as a literary trend, but never as a significant political phenomenon, assuming that the League of Arab States is not a significant political entity, which it frankly never has been. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that in that period of the Roman Empire and in the 18th and 19th centuries, or say 1750 to 1950, that you have parallel periods of extraordinary intellectual / spiritual / philosophical identity movements, and that they're competing with one another, and that we have a hard time fathoming this comparison because we tend to distinguish religions from philosophies or religions from political ideologies. But if you look at them as parallel overlapping adoption processes with competing concepts of what your adopter pool is, then you're perhaps closer to understanding some of the complications that arise and some of the modifications that you get in order to hold your adopters. The one most obvious being, which I mentioned in an earlier lecture, having to do with Marxism and the failure of the revolution to come. You say, well, the Marxists had thought the revolution would come in Germany. The revolution that started in Germany aborted, and the effective revolution was in Russia. And then you had later revolutions in other areas, particularly in China. Although that more a civil war than a revolution. But the fact that it didn't come in Germany, which had where the industrial proletariat were such a powerful part of the population, where you had so many leading intellectuals who were committed to the Marxist cause. What do you do when the revolution does not come? Now, my comparison would be with William Miller back in the 1840s. What do you do when you've predicted the Last Judgment and the end of the world and it doesn't come? You know, what do you do the next day? You change your date. You keep changing the date, or you say it actually came. But you do something to save the theory. So you have Marxists in the 1920s and the 30s coming up with new interpretations of Marxism that explain why the revolution did not come. And the reason for these changes is in order to hold on to their members. You know, you don't want everyone, you know, quitting the party simply because the revolution didn't come. You want them staying in the party, and so you change your ideology.
It occurs to me that part of this process, when you think about the Arab revolt and the Ottomans, you had late adopters who refused to be Arab nationalists. You have to essentially, you just write the late adopters out of history and say that they were Arab nationalists.
Yes, you know, the example here is the Arab revolt in the Ottoman Empire, where where you have to do something to account for the circumstances that, and so you get rid of some people, or you redefine them in certain ways. So Marxism becomes a non-revolutionary doctrine, or it becomes a revolutionary doctrine in which the revolution is still only believed in by the Maoists and the Trotskyites, and the mainstream are now interpreting it in a different way. And ultimately, the primary triumph of Marxism is in university professoriates, where ultimately we all became Marxists. We didn't become revolutionaries, didn't become party members. But on the other hand, a very large proportion of a university faculty will say that, particularly in the history department, will say that if you want to understand society, you must start with the infrastructure. You must say, how did people make a living? How did they produce the food? How did they build institutions that would produce some sort of social solidarity or class structure based upon this infrastructural base? You wouldn't have to have a dialectic. You wouldn't have to have a formal class sequence, but you could simply say the material order is more important than the spiritual order. In the early 19th century, there's pretty much a consensus that the spiritual order was more important than the material order. Most people right down through, let's say, the first quarter of the 20th century were oriented primarily toward their religious group, not toward their political party or toward their nationalist leanings. And yet these things would overlap because these, you're having parallel movements. Is the spiritual order more important than the material order? We are still debating that. And so virtually everyone in academia would say Darwinian evolution is true and intelligent design or divine creation is an error. Well, the intelligent design, the divine creationism, is something that people will move toward if they feel that the spiritual sense of things is the most important. And they say, well, we really don't care about those fossils or about their DNA, whatever it is, because we know from our books of Revelation what the truth is. Now that competition between a spiritual realm and a material realm intellectually, in the universities, the material realm holds sway more than the spiritual realm. Now, is that all attributable to Marxism? No, not all of it, but there's a little tinge of it. I found it out one year when about 7 or 8 years ago, an Iranian student came to Columbia, and I met him. He was not in my department. He said, "Oh, I'm so happy to be here at Columbia because this is where I'll be able to learn a Weberian interpretation of history from Professor Dabashi and a Marxist interpretation of history from you." I thought, me? My conservative Midwest background looked upon Marxism as something like, criminality of a serious sort. And the idea that someone would think I was a Marxist seemed absurd. And yet, as a social and economic historian, I certainly do affirm that the material infrastructure is where I start in my analysis of things. And I'm disinclined to ascribe very much to pure spiritual motivation. Okay, so what I would say is that Marxism evolves. It evolves according to an adopter curve in which people like me, to the degree we're Marxists, will be very, very late adopters, which we've discarded all that early stuff. We've discarded the revolution. We discarded the dialectic. We discarded the poor laboring proletariat. But we sort of like the inversion of Hegel's notion of the primacy of the spiritual over the material, and we go for the material. These movements all evolve so that nationalism is not a constant. Nationalism is one thing when you are hoping to join Garibaldi on the battlements and fight for Italian freedom or Italian unity, as opposed to what comes along later when you are conscripted into the Italian army and sent to Ethiopia or Libya and told to fight for the king, where your nationalism may now become somewhat attenuated. But nevertheless, you're part of the adopter pool, you're part of the national population, and these movements, these foreign wars, will all be interpreted as manifestations of nationalism, so that the magazines that are published in fascist Italy dealing with Libya all see it as the new Rome. Now Italy has regained this piece of the Roman Empire. So you have marvelous articles about the Roman ruins in Libya and so on to manifest this kind of nationalism. Now these isms that I'm talking about, I've stressed the ones that are in Europe. Although nationalism has a way of spreading, but then so does socialism, so does Marxism. They become syncretic as they spread, so that they do not necessarily retain the same characteristics that they would have in their earliest manifestations. But then there are other things that happen that seem to be autonomous, and yet they're happening at the same time. And here the one that stands out for its long-term consequences is the Meiji Restoration in Japan. The Japanese landholders who had dominated the society under the Tokugawa shogunate for several hundred years they came to a realization in the middle of the 19th century that their military capacity was insufficient to protect the Japanese islands from contact with foreign influences. There was a lot of disagreement on what should be done about that situation. The Tokugawa shogunate had an ideology that was based fundamentally on warfare, because you had the elite of the population was made up of samurai who were a hereditary caste of warriors who were brought up to be, to be warriors. Basically, they watched a lot of Hong Kong movies and so forth, learned how to do it right. But they didn't feel that they were capable of being warriors with respect to the foreign warships that were spotted off the coast of Japan. In a complicated series of arguments and debates among these landholders, they persuaded the Tokugawa family to step down from the shogunate, and they decided that the land of the shogun and the land of many other major landowners should be turned into national land and be handed over to the emperor. And so in 1867, the emperor was basically made the biggest landowner in Japan, by having his status as emperor restored. That's why it's called the Meiji Restoration. Meiji is the title, the name of the period when a Japanese monarch assumes the office of emperor. There's a regnal name that he adopts, and so Meiji becomes the regnal name for this period. This is 1867. You have a situation strikingly similar to what happened 40 years earlier, 60 years earlier, in Egypt under Muhammad Ali. That is to say, suddenly the state acquires a huge amount of wealth because this land is being handed over. Not only that, but when the land is handed over, the land had been used to produce revenues that would support the samurai. So now the emperor is given the job of paying the salaries of the samurai. And within 10 years, those salaries are converted into government bonds. And the samurai basically go to work as, bureaucrats and businessmen and so forth. Having spent hundreds of years as professional warriors, they stop doing that. What happens to the military? Well, just as with Muhammad Ali in Egypt, the military adopts conscription. So you go from having an elite military caste of highly trained soldiers to having conscripts with military service of 4 years plus additional years in reserve are required of every Japanese who reaches the age of 21. In a very short number of years, Japan becomes a major military power, as did Egypt under Muhammad Ali, to the point that, say, between 1911 and 1930, Egypt became powerful enough to threaten the entire Ottoman Empire. So in a period from 1867 down to the end of the, say down to 1880 or so, in those 13 years, during that period of time, Japan becomes powerful enough to go to war with China. And so you have the Sino-Japanese War that basically results in Japan taking over Korea, or begins with Japan trying to take over Korea, and this time they get Korea and then turn Korea into a source of raw materials, iron ore and coal for their industries. When you tell this story about Muhammad Ali in Egypt, or about Mahmud II, who does similar things in the Ottoman Empire starting in 1829, you tell the story normally as the influence of Europe and the modernization of the military, using European instructors in schools and so forth and so on. With Japan, that's harder to do. Japan is a very, very long distance away. In the case of the Ottoman Empire, you can show that there was awareness of Europe on the part of the Emperor Mahmud II. You can show that there was an awareness of Europe on the part of Muhammad Ali in Egypt. But you can't really show that there was much awareness of Europe on the part of the Meiji Emperor. The Meiji Emperor, who serves for a very long time as emperor, was brought up in a completely traditional background. His mother was a concubine of the preceding emperor, which meant that he never saw her. When he was born, he was placed by the palace bureaucracy with a courtier and his wife to be brought up in their home, and he never saw his father. I think he was about 6 years old before his father actually, looked at him and sort of nodded, and then he was taken away again. So he didn't grow up in the palace. He didn't grow up knowing anything about his father. He was nominally assigned a mother who was the empress. Because there was an empress. The emperor had one wife, and every child the emperor had by a concubine, if that child survived long enough and met the standards of the court, then that child was assigned a mother who was the empress. So technically he becomes the child of the emperor and the empress. He has nothing to do with that. He's brought up entirely by court functionaries who are completely removed from the active political life of Japan, because it's the period of the Tokugawa shogunate in which the emperors have no power and haven't had any power for hundreds of years. So what he learns from reading the Confucian classics, and then a certain degree about Buddhism. When he becomes emperor functionally in 1867, he does not change. We know of nothing written by the Meiji emperor, except that every year, at the beginning of the year, he would write a haiku on the year's annual topic. So everyone would write a New Year's haiku on a topic chosen by the palace. The moon over Mount Fujiyama. All right, now, the emperor writes his haiku, and everyone else of artistic aspiration in the country writes a haiku on the same theme. So we have the collection of the haiku written by the emperor. This is only his only known writings. All the pronouncements put out in his name were written by court functionaries. And yet he took this modernization very seriously. So that if there was going to be a new army, that would be a powerful army, he felt that he should go on maneuvers with the army. So he could see the new army in operation, he could inspire them by his presence. And he did, at great personal discomfort. He would have himself carried in a sedan chair out to a military encampment or proving grounds or practice area, even if it was 100 miles away, in order that he could observe his new army in maneuvers, because it was going to inspire them. But everything we know about the Meiji Emperor reflects the fact that he is trained as, and continues in his deepest soul to be, a Confucian gentleman, with no inspiration from the West at a personal level whatsoever. He will do his duty as to the land and to his people. But he's not a nationalist in the way that, say, a Bismarck or a Mazzini or a Muhammad or a Mahmud II would be a nationalist. He doesn't follow any ism in particular. So you end up with one of the most powerful countries in the world coming into being almost from a zero state in the second half of the 19th century without emanating from this complex welter of isms and changes in the economic and social order that were affecting Europe and the colonized areas in that time period. And it makes you wonder, well, did you really have to go through all of that tumult in Europe? Sometimes I think of this and I think, well, those first centuries of the Roman Empire, from say 200 to 300, where you had such complexity, would it have been better to be in the Persian Empire where you didn't have it, or where you had it to a lesser degree? I mean, is there a necessary connection between a moment of enormous complexity and change and the wealth and power that come to be associated with it? In other words, we attribute talking about the new power balance of this chapter, we attribute the rise of European power to physical changes and to ideological changes that are treated as though they are singular and have no comparison in history. To some degree, I think the technological changes are singular, particularly those that relate to the movement of people, goods, and information. In terms of the ideological changes, it's not clear to me that this is that singular an era. It only appears to be because we make a kind of artificial distinction between religious adoption or religious or philosophical adoption processes and ideological adoption processes that become distinctive of the 19th century. All right, I got through this lecture rather incoherently, but for better or worse, that's where we are.